thank you, Mr. Clerk, for the breakfast. It must be tough getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to prepare these breakfasts.
I'll take that note next time. Thank you.
We got to complain about salt, but we also got to complain about the coffee. What can we do? No, okay. Okay. Okay, we don't need to use up the entire hour talking about the breakfast. So I want to, on behalf of the committee, welcome our witnesses this morning. The International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. Jess Augustin is the retired former program manager. He will open, and I understand that Christina Palabay, Secretary General, will be by video conference using the first 5 minutes. And then we also have, by video conference from Project Plowshares, Dr. Branka Mirian. Welcome to everyone, and I'll call on Mr. Augustin for the opening 5 minutes between you and Madame Palabay. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and to the members of this committee. And thank you for giving us this opportunity to share some of our critical concerns, particularly on the human rights situation in the Philippines. And after my introductory remarks, Christina will follow me, will share also her concerns. In recent years, Canada has shifted its approach toward strengthening economic security and trade ties with the Philippines through its Indo-Pacific strategy, which emphasizes commercial growth and regional security. However, this increased defense collaboration raises critical concerns. Given Canada's strong stance on human rights, it is concerning that human rights are not made a precondition for trade and security cooperation with the Philippines. The ethical issues surrounding intensified defense cooperation with a country facing significant human rights abuses cannot be ignored. To maintain its integrity in foreign policy, Canada must prioritize human rights alongside its economic security and trade interests. Canada should demand that the Philippine government address these ongoing violations. Anything less risks severely damaging Canada's global reputation. It is essential for Canada to carefully reassess its defense cooperation to ensure that its action align with the values it consistently advocates on the world stage. Christina.
About 3 minutes left, please.
Good day to esteemed members of the National Defense Committee. Last week, we were with relatives of victims of human rights violations. Without graves to go to, families of the disappeared offered flowers for their loved ones. Since Marcos Sr., nearly 2,000 have been documented to have been abducted by state forces and have remained missing. 14 of them are rendered desaparecidos under Marcos Jr. We cried with families of drug war victims, as well as hundreds of those extrajudicially killed in the government's counter-insurgency campaigns. In the past 2 years, 105 farmers and indigenous peoples have been killed in this counter-insurgency war that the Philippine Armed Forces wages to end the communist movement through combat means. These gatherings reflect a disturbing continuum of the dire situation of human rights and international humanitarian law in the Philippines. We receive reports on the military operations and bombings in rural and indigenous communities, arms, weapons, and helicopters, most bought and acquired outside the Philippines are used in such operations, which hamlet communities or force them to evacuate, or in destroying farms, homes, schools, and livelihood. We fear that with the SOFBA being negotiated between our countries, Canadian troops and assets may be directly involved in these counterinsurgency campaigns that directly cause these violations. As Canada develops its security agreements with the Philippine government, we believe that it is critical to put human rights and IHL at the front and center of the discussions. There must be coherence of policy and practice as expounded on by your Voices at Risk guidelines, as well as human rights initiatives in the Summit for Democracy. We sincerely believe that the SOFBA will encourage, if not worsen, the climate of impunity in the Philippines and will place Canadian troops in the context of the counterinsurgency war, making Canada complicit in the violations committed in it. We advocate for peaceful, political, and diplomatic solutions in the Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia. We believe that we need to demilitarize, not escalate military tensions and increase military presence in the West Philippine Sea. And we need to try our very best so as not to worsen the already difficult rights landscape in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Marijan, 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak on the defense policy update. This update is a welcome step, particularly as it offers increased transparency into Canadian defense policy at a time of unparalleled global uncertainty. Canada, as a middle power with a strong multilateral tradition, is uniquely positioned to influence how we collectively address pressing security challenges. Today, I'd like to highlight 3 key areas of concern and follow them with 3 recommendations. The 3 key areas of concern are multiple and overlapping crises, climate change in the Arctic, and the transformative role of technology in warfare. First, the global community, including Canada, is facing a multitude of overlapping crises. The global security environment is increasingly volatile and is marked by great power competition and its ramifications. Conflicts such as those in Ukraine, the Middle East, and Sudan demonstrate that threats are rarely contained within boundaries of state or one region. They transcend borders and are more complex than ever before. We face the risk of nuclear weapons use in multiple contexts, and we're witnessing the decay of international arms control frameworks. International law, including international humanitarian law, is routinely violated. At the same time, climate-related disasters are affecting every nation, and new technologies like artificial intelligence are amplifying existing threats and creating new ones. We must recognize and acknowledge that none of these challenges can be resolved by military means alone. Rather, they require global dialogue and cooperation. Disappointingly, the concept of interdependence is not mentioned in this policy update, despite its relevance in addressing these crises effectively. As calls for increased defense spending grow louder in Canada and around the world, there's a tendency to label Canada a military laggard. Yet, as Ernie Regier, co-founder of Project Plowshares, points out, Canada ranks among the top 10% of the world's military spenders. Focusing on military spending as a percentage of GDP obscures this reality. Furthermore, the interconnected crises we face require more than military solutions. They demand investment in non-military security measures such as peace building and diplomacy, which remain significantly underfunded. While defense spending garners much attention, our diplomatic resources and capabilities have not received adequate investment or priority. Second, while the policy update identifies climate change and Arctic security as key concerns, it doesn't fully address the broader implications for global security and the well-being of Canadians. The Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defence are being called upon more often to respond to climate-related disasters within Canada. With their capacity and resources, they're often the best equipped to handle such emergencies. However, CAF leadership have recently indicated that their ability to respond to natural disasters may be strained due to other commitments. If the CAF lacks the capacity to respond to large-scale climate crises, which department will, we need a clear, detailed vision that outlines how the CAF and DND will adapt to climate-related challenges and support domestic disaster response. Moreover, an interagency protocol for disaster response is sorely needed, one that includes designated funding and resources for climate-related emergencies, ensuring that the CAF is not overstretched by this evolving role. The Arctic Changing security dynamics, particularly with heightened interest from major powers, elevate the urgency of a clear Canadian strategy to address both climate and security implications. Third, the policy update acknowledges the transformative impact of new technologies in warfare. However, terms like AI and machine learning appear with little substantive detail on how Canada plans to address technological threats or even leverage these advancements. Canada's stand on interoperability with allies, particularly around the deployment of potentially autonomous weapon systems, requires more precise articulation, especially on commitments to human oversight. Greater transparency and strategic planning in this area are critical to ensure that Canada's technological advancements meet ethical and legal standards. It is critical that Canada prioritizes development of a comprehensive framework for AI in defense, detailing its commitment to human control and legal accountability, and play a leading role in global discussions on autonomous weapon systems. In response to these concerns, I propose the following 3 recommendations. 1, strengthen interdepartmental collaboration and diplomatic capacity. 2, use a broader lens than security when examining climate change. 3, provide more guidance on the deployment of new technologies in defense. Mr. Chair, those of us in arms control and disarmament bear witness to the humanitarian costs of conflict and see firsthand how forward-thinking policies can save lives. Civil society's perspective is not one of naive optimism, but of informed realism, built on the grim realities we encounter and on the conviction that prevention is both possible and necessary. Thank you for your attention in considering these points.
Thank you, both witnesses, for not only your presentation, but the timeliness of your presentation. With that, we'll go to the 6-minute round. Mr. Bazan, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all our witnesses for joining us this morning. Dr. Marion, you're talking about the advancement in AI. I know over at the Ethics and Privacy Committee a couple of years ago, we did a study on the problems in facial recognition technology, artificial intelligence, and the biases that are often built into the algorithms that form the basis of things like machine learning, especially as there's racial and gender biases on it. So what type of guardrails should the Department of National Defense be looking at to ensure the technology that they either develop and or procure is not building in these prejudices? That's to Dr. Marion.
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's an excellent one, and it's certainly an issue that I think we're aware of at the national level, and certainly the Department of National Defense has been considering this issue. I think there are an incredible number of guardrails to put into considering which systems are used and for which purposes. Their AI systems will hallucinate, they will make mistakes, they have inbuilt biases. So the Department of National Defense needs to have a comprehensive strategy. I was consulted on the AI strategy the Department of Defense has put out, but it needs more substance to it. We need clarity on which systems for which purposes and in which applications. So are we using these things for back-end office things to recruit individuals? Are we using them for targeting? There are a vast number of concerns, of course, as we go down the spectrum of use, and there need to be clear policies and guidance for the Department of National Defense, which currently do not exist, on which systems are permissible and which ones are not. And I think the fact that you pointed to the issue of bias is incredibly important for this committee to consider as you think about the application of new and emerging technologies, because there will be biases built into these systems, and efforts technologically to address them won't be sufficient. So there needs to be clarity in who is making decisions and who's to be held accountable for those decisions when these systems are applied.
So I just want to continue on down that path with you, Doctor. As you're aware, AUKUS has Pillar 2, which is dedicated for Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom to do more in the areas of quantum computing, machine learning, AI, and cybersecurity. Do you believe Canada should strive to be part of Pillar 2 to work with our other Five Eye partners to develop that technology to ensure that we're best prepared to deal with the challenges of the future with our adversaries?
I think AUKUS is a particular agreement, set of commitments, and I'm not sure that Canada necessarily needs to join this agreement. I think we are, through the partnership with Five Eyes and through other international commitments and summits, we're already engaging on these issues, particularly through the Responsible Military AI summits that have happened in the Netherlands and Korea. So I'm not sure that joining this initiative is necessary for the further clarification that needs to happen on the military applications of artificial intelligence and indeed other emerging technologies such as quantum computing. I think that this is up for that. This should be something that should be considered and debated at the political level. However, I do think that there are plenty of other opportunities where we engage with allies and like-minded states on these issues.
So if you're looking at our adversaries, particularly the cybersecurity threats that are coming from the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, Iran, North Korea, do you think they're having any ethical concerns about the development of this new technology and how it could impact upon Canadians?
I think one of the challenges, if we sort of posit ourselves against those states, that it becomes a race to the bottom, because I think there are a lot of things that are acceptable in the People's Republic of China and Russia, North Korea, that I don't think we would ever want in a Canadian democracy. So I think that there's considerations there for democracies about ethical applications of technologies. The best, I think, approach that we have is diplomacy, and we have to work with those adversarial states. Unfortunately, our discussions at the international level have largely focused on like-minded or similarly minded states, and we don't engage often enough with adversaries. There are some instances of bilateral discussions between particularly the United States and China on some of these emerging technologies, but there is also an enormous race, whether it's from semiconductors or other aspects of emerging technologies that are sort of hampering what's possible in the diplomatic domain. So for Canada, I am aware that there are, of course, concerns regarding these adversarial states, and I don't want to undermine them or somehow downplay them. I think they are quite an issue for us to address. However, I do think that we don't want to go down this route of a race to the bottom and saying if it's acceptable for China, it should be acceptable for us. I think we have better values and standards than that.
In the 20 seconds that is left, would you be able to tell committee what do you think the best expertise Canada can bring to the table in advancing the new technologies in the interest of national security?
We have enormous technical talent. We have enormous legal and policy expertise, and we just don't have the resources or capacity at Global Affairs or even the Department of National Defense. So we need to dedicate more resources to these issues and these files as they will become more prominent on the international stage. And indeed, we're already seeing their impacts on the battlefields.
Thank you, Mr. Rouzan. Ms. Lapointe, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Augustin, Canada's new defense policy emphasizes the importance of protecting human rights and promoting global security. And given the human rights concerns you've raised and the comments that you made in your opening statement where you said Canada needs to ensure that this new policy aligns with the values it states to have on the world stage, how do you see Canada balancing its defense commitments with a strong commitment to human rights? And what specific actions would you suggest to ensure Canada's defense policy supports human rights globally?
Well, there are a number of actions and possibilities. That one is and we know that the status of visiting forces agreement is being negotiated. That to ensure that human rights is a precondition for any agreement to be finalized. I think second is it's important that we support grassroots organizations like Karapatan in documenting human rights abuses, because the world is actually not aware that there is war going on in the Philippines. No, bombings is taking place, extrajudicial killings is happening, journalists are being suppressed, no? And most recently, a group that is promoting a peace negotiation or asking the government to resume the peace agreement that was negotiated years ago. They were arrested, and so I think it's imperative for Canada that in any of this negotiation with the military, with the Philippine government, that human rights are part of the deal.
Yeah. So are there specific safeguards you would recommend to ensure that defense initiatives don't inadvertently contribute to the risks faced by activists or journalists and human rights defenders?
Whether there are cases where Canada was directly involved?
Or are there things that we should be aware of where we won't contribute to the plight of these activists and defenders?
Yes, I think the visiting forces agreement that is being negotiated, which will put Canada's soldiers on the ground, is already a danger sign that Canada will be involved in the counter-insurgency campaign of the government. The whole nation approach of the government, there is which is the driving cause of human rights violation in the Philippines. They have the task force to end local communism. And that's very dangerous because a lot of us, including people here in Canada, are being red tagged just because we're promoting peace, because we're just promoting human rights. And the moment you say that, then the government, the military, tells you that you are part of this insurgency. And I think it's important that Canada doesn't get embroiled in that kind of dynamics that's happening in the Philippines. And by directly supporting a military, with history of human rights violation, abuses for decades, I think Canada is becoming directly complicit to what is happening now in the Philippines. People are saying that there is an improvement, big improvement between Duterte's government and the Marcos government. No, it's not true. In fact, the drug war continues, and it's now being the biggest topic in the Senate of the Philippines. But the killing continues, particularly extrajudicial killing, arbitrary arrests, and so on.
Thank you.
Or maybe Tinay?
Dr. Marajan, given the increasing militarization of the Arctic by other powers, particularly Russia, how do you assess Canada's current capacity to defend its Arctic region, and how can this policy help to address those emerging security challenges in the North?
Thank you so much for that question. I think there is a great deal of cooperation that still happens in the Arctic. There's aspects of Arctic security that are not necessarily militarized yet, but I do think we do see this trend from other great powers as well, and the rites of passage through that area that I think are of concern to Canada, and we certainly need to be prepared for that reality. And again, with climate change, I think there's going to be greater issues in terms of the capacity and ability to really patrol and control that region. I do think there's still a lot that we need to consider in terms of non-security aspects of this issue. There is going to be a need for greater cooperation amongst Canada and these more adversarial states, particularly Russia. I think we are very much concerned about this, and I think the defense policy update is gearing towards sort of a more military response. I don't see, however, the same level of thinking about non-military responses and the communities in that region, and the indigenous communities in that region, indeed, and their knowledge and their contributions. I think we risk overly militarizing this region at the cost of the effective responses that will be necessary because of climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Bernal-Joseph. Bienvenue au comité. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Augustine, there is something quite interesting which you raised. You said Canada in its policies should put at the center of all its international policy the issue of human rights. We understand that Canada is not a commercial or military superpower. But as a Quebec sovereigntist, I think defending human rights is important. You spoke about the direct or indirect participation of Canada in violating human rights in the Philippines. There are thousands of Canadians living in the Philippines. Are you aware of allegations of people violating human rights? Could the committee hear you on that?
Violation that is,
de la part de...
sorry.
Carried out by Canadian mining companies, people that are working in the Philippines.
Indeed, direct connection between the displacement of indigenous people because of the mining operation. It's already well documented that Canadian minings are involved in human rights violation, particularly the indigenous people who are being affected. But not only that, those who are helping them, the environmentalists opposing are also being ragtagged and not only arrested but murdered, killed. And if you look at the map in the Philippines and the data where the human rights violations are happening, you see the direct correlation where the mining operation is happening and where arrests and killings and even massacres are happening. So definitely there is a big connection.
Donc, si je comprends ce que...
So if I understand what you're saying, Mr. Augustin, not only does Canada support a government that is carrying out violations of human rights, but beyond that, they are unable to control their own mining companies that are working in the Philippines and violating human rights. That's quite paradoxical, and it's quite contradictory. You also spoke about people, Filipinos who are overseas and that are undergoing transnational abuse carried out by the Philippine government. It's very paradoxical that Canada, in many fora, is saying China has been interfering in our elections system, that China has carried out cyber attacks against Canada, and that Canada criticizes the fact that China carries out transnational repression, but on the other hand, they are supporting a government that's behaving precisely in the same manner as Beijing. Don't you find this quite paradoxical as far as Canada's position goes?
Well, the good thing about Canada is it has all this policy, human rights policy in place. There is voices at risk that we should be following. But, and this is part of our recommendation, that Canada should reassess its involvement in the Philippines, particularly related to the military, and use the existing policy that's already in place. The Voices at Risk is a very good policy that would protect human rights defenders, and human rights defenders includes those who are concerned about the mining operations in the Philippines.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Professor Marianne. You said we have to use diplomacy to achieve our goals. You stressed the issue of diplomacy. So how can we honestly think that diplomatic policy with China, as you just said, China is interfering in Canadian elections, they're carrying out cyber attacks against Canada, so how would it be possible to use diplomacy to promote our position in Southeast Asia? I don't see how we can convince Beijing through diplomatic means to do those things. That's a question I have.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think it's fair to assess China's policies, movements in these areas as being of concern. I think the challenge for Canada and other middle powers is to figure out a way to work diplomatically because there are no military solutions to those issues. So I think one of the areas where Canada could perhaps spend more diplomatic heft is to work with other middle powers and consider the ways to engage China when we're concerned. Also working with the United States. I know there's a new administration coming and there will be challenges for engagement, but there are also opportunities. I don't know what the other solution would be if we don't engage diplomatically. As I think you noted yourself, we're not a military power. We're not going to be able to make much of a change. We work best when we work with allies and through alliances. And I think that's sort of the reality that we have to face here. That does not mean that we're not concerned and we shouldn't be looking at our own national security and defense. And indeed we are. We're quite, I think, good at cybersecurity in particular and staying on top of the threat that is coming from the People's Republic of China. However, again, I think diplomacy is not easy. I think we have to sort of figure out ways we can work with our allies to best respond to China's movements and to consider which ways, we could do that, whether it's multilaterally, whether it's bilaterally with allies.
We're going to have to leave
So I think there are opportunities.
Thank you very much. Madame Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. Augustin and Ms. Palbe, so you had mentioned Canada's potential agreements like the visiting forces agreement several times in the prompt, but can you expand on how that worsens that culture of impunity that currently exists in the Philippines? And then in addition, you had mentioned both the increasing trade of weapons and the drug trade. What are the countries that are mainly involved in that, and how can Canada better help in those instances?
Could we ask
yes, of course,
Christina?
yes.
Yeah.
Ms. Palbe? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, thank you. We have had several history of abuses committed through visiting forces agreements by another country. So there are rapes, there are other forms of violence. The question is about jurisdiction most of the time. And at the same time, this brings to fore the concerns on the SOFA between our two countries and its implications when one, Canada's soldiers on the ground will have a presence here, then it may play into the how the Philippine Armed Forces would use your presence here in conducting counterinsurgency operations. The second is on how it is perceived. In the Philippines, there was a poll this middle of this year on the role of the U.S. In the tensions with China. And there's very little support, I think 8% only, of those polled who are supportive of such actions. And I think it comes from that very history of abuses of of foreign troops who come into the country and are perceived to have conducted themselves in a way that is not in alignment with international human rights law and the IHL. And in relation to, sorry, Jess?
Yeah, I think you answered the question.
Right, and then in terms of arms trade and drug trade, who are the main?
Well, in terms of hardware, military hardware, well, the U.S. is number one supporter. No, they have $500 million that they just gave to the Philippines in terms of arms, and they have also increased their military presence that started from 5 locations, bases, to about now 9. And so that includes a lot of military equipment, training, logistical support, operation, and so on.
Ms. Marajan, I'll switch over to you. You discussed the issues in terms of the focus on a 2% defense spending as obscuring the issue. And I know that Project Plowshares has often talked about the 5 Ds of defense, diplomacy, development, disarmament, and democracy. Can you talk about that obscurity further on that 2% and our seeming focus on what others have often called that as a problematic focus, I guess?
Absolutely. I think the 2% is really an arbitrary number that's not, it's not based on evidence. It's not evidence-based policymaking. It does not tell us the specifics of each context of national security, defense context for each state. So I think we need to be much more clearer about what we're demanding from the CAF and DND and why the increase in defense spending is necessary and what the vision there is. There's a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach with this number. We've said in the past that this is such a nice round number for political reasons, but it doesn't really speak about the actuality of defense needs. And I think that we need to stop kind of looking at this number as an answer, to actual really deep study needed on what's actually needed for Canadian defense and how we contribute globally. I think it's also undermining how much Canada contributes in other ways that are not purely militarily. When we work with NATO allies in other contexts, how much we contribute with development and diplomacy indeed. So I think a focus on that number alone has obscured the reality of actually Canada's contributions on many other levels as well.
30 seconds.
So I guess ultimately this idea that, and we have to move away from the idea that defense is first and humanitarianism or that aid is second, and that's how we do it. That's how we do it with how we spend our money as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, I think we have really underinvested in diplomacy and are not aware of the costs of that, even for defense. I think we are seeing more and more conflicts that need to be resolved with diplomatic, solutions. But if we don't have the capacity to do that, then we are not contributing, to global peace and security, and we're not certainly contributing to work of our allies. So it goes hand in hand. We cannot have humanitarianism come second, and investments into diplomacy and development and peace building comes second, because those are really the root causes of these conflicts. And prevention is always, better than having to deal with sort of the full fallout, which I will say, humanitarian.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Mr. Allison, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and our witnesses. Thank you for being here today. So to the doctor, just you've been talking. You've talked about AI, and you understand that. And certainly, as we look at the DPU's issues around defense and security challenges, we know that new and disruptive technology is going to be an issue as we move forward. That's one of the things that has been highlighted. My question to you then is, Minister Blair made an announcement last week on AI. And so my question is just, can you just give us your thoughts on how our government's doing in order to sort of harness this power of AI and whether or not, we're sort of reaching our potential in the defense sector?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of, I think, discussion and movement on understanding the implications of artificial intelligence for the military at the Department of National Defense. However, much more needs to be done. We are one of the first countries, I think, to have an AI strategy, but the strategy is more of a kind of a guidance or a vision document. It's not really telling us what the policies are. And so I think the hard work that needs to come now is really developing those policies. We have the AI talent. I said earlier, we have the legal and technical, expertise. We can, I think, be a leader in this sphere. We've generally been a leader in broader discussions on AI, but on military discussions of AI, again, because of capacity issues at both GAC and DND, we have not had, I think, the role that we could be playing because there's simply an issue of capacity. So we need to address that. And it's both to leverage AI for defense, but also to consider the ethical and legal implications that our other allies are concerned with. So even in UN discussions, we're not at the forefront, highlighting ethical and legal concerns simply because we do not seem to have political vision on how we wish to proceed with the technology. So political vision has to come on this file. It's not a matter of a lack of legal or technical expertise.
Thank you. So, as I continue on the thought of AI then, so to your knowledge then, do you think the government's doing enough to try and integrate this AI technology? And like, how would you compare us, when we're looking at our allies? Is there anything that you understand to be, or you could compare us to in terms of where we're at? You mentioned we have the capability and the ability, but how do we fare against our neighbors to the south of the border?
I think if we compare it to the United States, I mean, the United States is an absolute leader in defense applications of AI. So I don't think we have the budget or the capacity to compare ourselves to the United States because they far outpace every other nation. However, if we compare ourselves to similar states, I would say that we're generally in the range. We haven't fallen behind. I think that's one of the misperceptions. We have a lot of investment into, AI research, both for civilian and military purposes, and a lot of this technology is dual use. So it's coming from the civilian sector into the military sector. I think later witnesses will talk about procurement and what that means. That's not an issue that I focus on, but I will tell you that I don't think we have fallen behind. I think we're quite concerned and at the forefront of thinking about the integration of these systems. Again, what we're seeing though is that there's countries like the Netherlands and the Republic of Korea that are leading in, these international discussions. I think that we could kind of model ourselves on a bit more and see how we can contribute more, because that's where the lag really is. It's not on the technical side, it's more on the regulatory side.
Thank you. So one last question around the same issue then. You talked about some of our allies in the U.S. Just your thoughts. I got a minute left. Just your thoughts on how we would maybe compare to places like China and Russia. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's much more interdependent than people think. There's a perception that China and Russia can outpace, the U.S. and its allies. That's not accurate. The United States still controls a lot of the hardware, the technical know-how in terms of the most advanced AI systems. So I think what we see is when we see Russia and China deploying certain systems, they're still dependent on Western components and on Western technologies. So that relationship is much more interdependent than we are often led to believe. And that means that there are critical minerals that come from China and Russia for some of this technological development that we need to be aware of. So I think focusing on interdependence would be much more helpful than on this race between the great powers.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Mr. Pawlowski, 5 minutes.
Mr. Agustin, mabuhay. I was interested in what you had to say about human rights abuses in the Philippines. Certainly under Duterte, they were rampant. The shoot first, ask questions later policy, he seemed proud of it. My wife's from Davao, so I kind of follow things. I thought things had improved quite a bit under Marcos. You certainly don't hear nearly as much about killings related to drug abuse, and the killings in the drug war, as you know, weren't just going after drug traffickers, but it was people who used drugs, or even people who were suspected of used drugs, or even people who were accused of using drugs were routinely killed. And you're saying that things haven't improved under Marcos, or they have somewhat, or how does it compare now under Marcos as opposed to Duterte?
Christina could also answer that, but definitely the drug war, the killings, kind of eased a bit, but it still continued, and we have all the data to prove that. But the extrajudicial killings, the arbitrary arrests, the targeting journalists continues, and there has been no real marked improvement. The focus now of the Senate, now it's unraveling, all the brutality of the drug war. The problem there is it overshadows the current situation in the Philippines where the Marcos Jr., the administration, continues with human rights violation under this whole national security approach, which targets people that oppose, for example, the question of mining, the question of the way we look at the economy of the country that's not improving, and anyone who oppose to that and criticize the government, they get arrested. Yeah.
You also talked about people being killed in the counterinsurgency movement. That's against the NPA. New People's Army, or is that Abu Sayyaf, or is that a combination? And then you also talked about what would seemingly be politically motivated killings because people opposed the government. Certainly what was prominent under Duterte was drug-related killings. Has the nature of the human rights abuses shifted, so it's not so much related to drugs now, but it's more related to political suppression or to counterinsurgency, or how has it changed under Marcos?
Christina?
Hello. Well, I think qualitatively, there has been a shift in terms of, well, one, the bodies in the drug war definitely are not as much as before. There's no rhetoric, just like the previous administration. But indeed, the drug war continues because the policies have not been rescinded. The memorandum circulars of the police have not been rescinded. So we think that's the reason why the killings continue. In the counterinsurgency campaigns, we think there was no let-up from Duterte to Marcos, precisely because the approach remains the same. The blueprint, the policy, the national security policy remain the same. And the funds, the prioritization of resources has been much more under the current administration. There's what is called confidential and intelligence funds, and these funds are all across government agencies budgets, including the office of the president, and that is also one of the things that's being investigated right now in our Congress, the use of such funds in committing human rights abuses.
Thank you, Mr. Pawlowski. Monsieur Brunel Duceppe, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. We have discussed human rights and also spoke about trade between the two countries, Canada and the Philippines. So there is a dilemma before us here. The question is, should we carry on trade with a country where there are human rights abuses? At the same time, if we stop trading, we stop creating wealth within that country. And in the long run, we say if we create wealth, there would be more liberal policies that are implemented by the government. That's the dilemma some have raised. So to what point should we place at the center of our defense policies the issue of human rights? And also, how can we do this while trading with those same countries? Mr. Augustino.
With the Philippines, in fact, we encourage Canada, but there has to be human rights guidelines, and also not to militarize its relationship. We're so proud of Canada I work in the humanitarian organization. We are very impressed with Canada's DART program, the disaster response, and during the Haiyan super typhoon. When Marcos was overthrown, we actually encouraged Canada to start supporting, the Philippines to rehabilitate its bankrupt economy. So we Canada is also well known for its contribution to development aid and to promote small businesses and so on. This Indo-Pacific strategy created a tension where support to a military becomes, again, the excuses is China, becomes the predominant concern in dealing with the Philippines. So when you look at our Canadian embassy talking about how great the government is and emphasizing trade relationship without even mentioning that like what Christina was saying, human rights violations are continuing, corruption continues, and so you cannot have trade when the institution, the structure of the country remains the same all the way from the time when the father of Marcos
we're going to have to leave it there.
Sorry.
This has been a pretty wide-ranging discussion, and I've sat here and kind of let it range. We are studying the defense policy update, so if you could, by some means or another, tie it back into Canada's defense policy update, the Indo-Pacific, the presence of our troops on Philippine soil, and the interaction of our military relationships, that would be helpful. It's not as if what's being talked about isn't critical in the overall bigger policy, but this is a subset of a policy, namely defense policy update. Ms. McPherson, welcome to the committee. 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I note that you gave that warning before I spoke, which I think seems like there may be a rationale for that. It's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you very much for being here. And I know we were talking about human rights, and that's perhaps not something that has to do with defense, but it is an issue for me. I know I've worked with Mr. Bernal Duceppe a lot on Canadian mining companies and the impacts they've had on human rights in the Philippines and in other areas. But let's keep this to defense. Could you talk a little bit about how Canada could assist in terms of de-escalating the conflict in the South China Sea, please?
Well, I think it's important that the whole South China Sea is demilitarized. I think the presence of the U.S. And other allies in the South China Sea only escalates the tension. It it provokes China, and that puts the Philippines in a situation where they have to defend themselves. What we are discussing with our partners is that it has to be let the ASEAN countries deal with the problem with China, and let's not not other countries like the U.S. and if you look at the U.S. involvement and then the Chinese intervention, the U.S. presence is all over the Philippines.
For historical and for many reasons. Very quickly, can you comment on what you might think the change, what change you expect, knowing the election results from the U.S.?
I think it will remain the same, but most likely Canada will be asked to pay more, given the current administration, and is that what Canada wants? No, and to pay more, I think Canada should put more investment in diplomacy, in peace building, in humanitarian, with all the typhoons that's happening. Yeah, Canada should put more on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stewart, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Dr. Marion, I wanted to ask you about, first, the applications of technology in our Arctic. And with the defense policy update, do you think that the government is providing the adequate resources from a technology standpoint to our Canadian Rangers in the north who are up there in our first line of defense?
Yeah, I think there's a certain awareness about the need to provide technology. I think there are environmental conditions that are still a challenge for some of the technologies that we're discussing, or some of them that are emerging still. So I do think there's a bit of a need to further study how best and what technology to provide. So that's, I think, something that should be further examined, and I think is pointed to in the defense policy itself. There's a whole lot of need to further look and further understand. There are certainly technologies that are going to be really helpful for search and rescue as well. So I think there are.
I'm thinking specifically of the Canadian Rangers, and if you saw any evidence of providing those personnel with better and more technology.
I think we're still probably in the early days of that. I think some of the advanced tools.
The next question I had was, and sorry, we just are time limited here. You mentioned earlier that Canada's in the top 10% of military spend. Is that globally of NATO, or where is that top 10%?
Globally.
Okay.
Globally.
And then how far would that gap be between the top of that 10% and the bottom of that 10%?
There is a significant gap.
So,
I think we tend to compare ourselves to the United States, but then if you look at the U.S. budget, it still outpaces any other
no, of course.
collection of states.
Of course, but if we compare ourselves to other middle powers in NATO that you had talked about earlier, that we need to do more work with them to kind of advance diplomacy, where do we compare to some of those other countries? And where are we in that 10%? Are we at the bottom of that 10% or in the middle of it?
Yeah, we are, I think, fairly squarely in the middle on a lot of these things. I think we tend to think of ourselves as being much less significant militarily than we actually are when compared to other middle powers. Of course, there's been a spending spree by other middle powers, some of them due to geographic reasons and recent developments. So I think we're not a laggard by any means.
If we were to look at our defense spending and we didn't measure it on GDP, or maybe one factor would be GDP, would other ones be things like land size, the amount of resources you're trying to protect, and we may arrive at a number much bigger than 2% if we did that exercise. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I can certainly see that being one perspective. I do think the challenge that we have is of a vast territory that's underpopulated, and it's a very unique challenge. We also, I think, have to consider the broader defense context and geography is destiny in many ways. And with a strong ally to the south still, despite whatever administration comes in, I think we tend to overplay some of the defense concerns for ourselves, and we never work alone. We're always working with allies. So I think the other factor that should be put in there as well is, collaborating and working with allies.
You get a minute and a half.
I do? Okay, good. Thank you. If I can take another change of direction here. You mentioned earlier that we should be cooperating with Russia. Where can we cooperate with Russia?
I think there are multilateral institutions. I'm not saying we cooperate with Russia. I think we should have a very realistic diplomatic engagement. Again, working with our allies, because that relationship is quite fractured. We, I think, have to engage these adversaries. We don't live in a world where we cannot engage with them. I can understand how for many communities in Canada that's not something that's very palpable, but I think the reality of diplomacy is precisely that we need to talk with adversaries, not just like-minded states.
Okay, and then if we think about some of the excellent technology companies that we've got in Canada, we've got quantum computing, for example. Are we using those civilian technological advantages to help prepare ourselves for for military applications of those technologies, such that we can punch above our weight?
I think one challenge that we have is that we're actually not using those companies to the extent that we should be for our economic gain. And then when we look at military applications, I think there is a gap there in terms of understanding how these technologies could be applied and also how they could be misused. So there's an enormous opportunity here. If there is, political will to understand economic advantages, we have an enormous intellectual property issue. We're losing a lot of intellectual property, including to our allies. So we have a lot more work that needs to be done on that front.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Final 5 minutes, Mrs. Lalonde.
Thank you very much to all our witnesses this morning. Maybe I'll start my question towards Ms. Merrigan, and as we are talking within this committee, I would like to hear a little bit more about the research projects that you and Project Plowshares are currently undertaking, and maybe how does this relate to the Canada Defence Policy update?
Absolutely. We have one broad project on understanding climate impacts and understanding indeed how how Canada can best respond to coming climate emergencies and what's sort of the role or the vision for the CAF there in responding to these emergencies. My own project is examining responsible military AI regulation and where Canada sort of fits in the broader international frameworks and how we're contributing to those discussions, including to the U.S.-led political declaration on responsible military AI and autonomy, and Canada is co-chairing a working group there on accountability. So examining issues of accountability and transparency in military applications of artificial intelligence.
Thank you. You did, on that note, what would you recommend from your current research to this committee?
I think Canada could play a much more significant role in the discussions on autonomous weapons at the international level. We've sort of sat on the sidelines of that discussion. We haven't really contributed much. Again, I think there's an issue of resources and capacity there, both at Global Affairs and D&D. I think we could play a much more significant role in the broader discussion, responsible military AI and autonomy that is happening as part of these summits. Canada could certainly be a leader in that sphere, working with our allies again. And that discussion is a multi-stakeholder discussion, so it brings together academics, industry, and also has a diplomatic component to it. So I think being more engaged in these two discussions at the international level would benefit us as we kind of consider how best to craft our defense policy.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I'll try to see with you if you had, I know you did mention the word, and it's challenging, I think, for all of us to consider that aspect where currently the illegal Russian invasion in Ukraine, and you did mention Russia and China, and I had the pleasure of sitting on the Canada-China committee. It is, for me, I have to say, a little bit difficult to think that as you want to engage with those adversaries, it is counterintuitive of what we're trying to do, which is Ukraine to win. Maybe share with us a little bit more in depth. I would like to hear how does that work in the big spectrum? And like you said, it's a very sensitive subject here in Canada.
Absolutely. I think I really empathize with the Ukrainian community and what Ukraine is going through. And I think one of the things that we have said from the outset of this conflict is that there is going to be some sort of diplomatic solution. Military victory at the moment, at least, it seems elusive. And so we're seeing sort of, Ukrainian lives really, being lost, and Ukraine is suffering a great deal. So I think there is going to be a push for, certainly with the new U.S. administration, some sort of diplomatic agreement. So I think Canada needs to consider all our options and consider how that will move forward. Again, I think there is, as you said, this is a politically sensitive issue, and no one wants to, I think, undermine Ukraine's need to really defend itself. And I think we have to, though, consider what sort of what things might happen, including with our ally to the south, what their position on this conflict will be like, and we have to prepare for that. I think we don't live in a world of ideals. We have to take the world as it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that brings our questioning to a close. And I just, on behalf of the committee, want to thank all three of you for your patience and getting up early in the morning and being ready to talk, and very helpful to our study on the defense policy update. So with that, I'll suspend, and we'll re-empanel as quickly as we can. this committee, and we appreciate their appearance, and also need no introduction. So with that, I will call upon Dr. Lagacé, Associate Professor Carleton first, and then a person who needs absolutely no introduction, Retired General Andy Leslie, for the second 5 minutes. So, sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to share with the committee my ideas on the defense update. I will concentrate since the law for Libra was published, this committee can closely follow these three commitments and making sure that the executive follows them through.
Canadian Patrol Submarine Project, 2, defense digitization, and 3, reaching the goal of 2% of GDP for defense spending by 2032. This past summer, the government announced that Canada would be moving ahead with the acquisition of new submarines. A request for information was then released to potential bidders. The RFI indicates that the government is aiming to procure a military off-the-shelf design with minimal modifications. The current strategy is squarely focused on acquiring the boats, then managing the integration of specialized weapon systems or the onboarding of new systems after they are delivered. Although this strategy comes with notable risks around future integration and adaptation costs, it is the right approach. The fact is, having imperfect boats is better than having no boats at all. I therefore recommend that this committee keep a close eye on the CPSP project with a view to guarding against efforts to Canadianize or otherwise modify the boats before they are delivered.
Le ministère de la Défense nationale et des Forces armées avance également sur la voie de la numérisation de la défense, en moins en théorie.
Digitalization, and this effort should be a priority. Otherwise, the Canadian Armed Forces will not be able to fully exploit its new fleets, and Canada will fall behind its key allies. Indeed, this committee should push the government to move forward with a comprehensive digitalization strategy for the entire Canadian national security community, which may necessitate a rethinking of existing data sovereignty policies. Unless Canada accelerates its digitalization efforts, we will be unable to remain fully interoperable with our allies, and our case for joining Pillar 2 of the AUKUS will be weakened.
Of GDP target for defense spending. Canada will only reach this target if there is a cross-party consensus. Having this committee speak with a single voice about the need to reach this target and holding all government to account when they fall short is essential. Suffice to say, the results of Tuesday's presidential election in the United States reinforces the importance of reaching this target, lest Canada suffer the economic consequences of being seen as a defense laggard. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. General Leslie, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
My intent is to offer some criticism of the status quo so that we can learn, and then perhaps in question period get into some solutions. Essentially, in my opinion, strong, secure, engage, the precursor to the current defense policy, delivered nothing substantive in terms of modern military equipment, which saw Canada, in fact, become weaker, more insecure, and essentially absent from the deployable stables of troops required for either United Nations missions or, of course, NATO. The 2024 defense policy update of Our North Strong and Free is no better, unfortunately, in that it promises some urgently needed equipment years from now, but nothing today. Indeed, the 2024 defense spend will be less than that of 2023. Of course, we're well aware of what just happened down in the United States. Both Republicans and Democrats are united and increasingly vocal about telling Canada how disappointed, frustrated, and fed up they are with Canada's failure to defend itself and their allies, with a special mention on the Arctic. Meanwhile, as we know, and I was involved in the last NAFTA renegotiations, that's coming due at a time when a variety of key players down south have articulated clearly the base of 3% perhaps looms on the horizon, and how defense, security, trade, and border security are all intertwined. At this time of crisis internationally, with what's happening in the Middle East, in Ukraine, Canada's military readiness is at its lowest level in 50 years.
Canada spent last year in 2023 more money on consultants and professional services than it did on the Army, Navy, and Air Force combined, which, quite frankly, is madness. The Army has over 50% of its vehicle fleets which are awaiting spare parts and technicians. The Navy is struggling mightily, bless them, to keep elderly warships, a handful of them at sea, specifically in the Indo-Pacific, and they're desperately short of trained sailors. And the Air Force has been unable to participate in significant NATO deterrent exercises either up north or out over the oceans in conjunction with our friends and allies because they don't have the pilots, the spare parts, or the money to fly the aircraft. In the Arctic, which is many times larger than Europe, Canada has fewer than 300 military support staff who are not deterrent. They're essentially unarmed. Some of them are part-time, bless them, and about 1,600 Skidoo equipped with rifles, Canadian Rangers, who are not combatants. Their role is to observe and report. The bottom line is that Canada has no permanently assigned combat elements to deter potential presence by the Russians or the Chinese who are showing up in our waters with increasing frequency, but other people do. Russia specifically has between 25 to 35,000 combat troops deployed in their Arctic with huge amounts of operational equipment, air, land, and sea. The United States, bless them, has 22,000 full-time military and part-time military professionals with more equipment than the entirety of the Canadian forces in terms of combat delivery. So really, thank you, America, for defending our Arctic. We are facing unprecedented dangers and challenges, and quite frankly, I see no sense of urgency to change, to modify, to re-guide the efforts of the government towards supporting and assisting the Canadian forces. Some facts. We have less than 35 military personnel deployed on UN missions. In 2003, we had close to 2,500. We are the only NATO nation whose level of military operational readiness is going down when everyone else is skyrocketing up. We have the longest and least efficient procurement system in NATO, indeed in any nation that I can find. We are the only nation in NATO that does not have a costed plan to get to 2% of GDP, which was first agreed to by Minister of Defense in 2008 and reiterated in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and I could go on. We are the only NATO nation whose defense minister has publicly admitted that he could not convince his fellow cabinet members of the importance of NATO defense spending and the 2% GDP. And as mentioned already, we're the only NATO nation whose defense budget decreased this year. Mr. Chair, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. With that, we turn to Madame Gallant.
General Leslie, under the most severe circumstances, if Canada does not fill the blind spot with our satellites, install air defense in the far north, patrol the Arctic waters, and the U.S. feels threatened and exposed, what will the Americans do to protect our continent's northern flank?
There's an old saying, which is sometimes true, which is sovereignty has to be seen to be effective. And in our case, our sovereign troops deployed in the Arctic, through no fault of their own, due to lack of equipment, lack of numbers, lack of training, lack of resources, which boils down to taxpayer money, has resulted in, from a Canadian perspective, our Arctic is undefended. So the more that the Americans get used to the idea of they have to secure and defend it for us, it's logical to assume that they may well look to some sort of economic compensation from the resources in that Arctic, which Canadians, it's hard to find any Canadian who doesn't admire the beauty, the pristine nature of our Arctic. But we have to spend time, money, and effort to make sure it remains ours with our friends and allies.
Former NATO Parliamentary Assembly President and senior member of the Armed Services Committee, now chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Congressman Mike Turner recently wrote an op-ed in Newsweek entitled "Trudeau, Not Trump, is the Greatest Threat to NATO." Why does the DPU evoke such a sense of non-confidence from our greatest ally?
Canada spends a considerable amount on the bigger picture defense issues. And as you're well aware, in 2017, NATO changed the rules wherein a whole host of issues ancillary to the business of fighting and winning the nation's wars were counted as defense spending. Veterans, pensions, some of the support agencies, and the list goes on. What we have to do is question the output for the Canadian investment in defense. And output is a variety of many factors. It includes well-trained, fit, capable men and women who are willing to go overseas and do dangerous things on our behalf. They have to have the right equipment, they have to have the right facilities, they have to have the right training infrastructure and the money to buy ammo. And by the way, how's that ammo contract going? I'm sorry, I'm asking you a question. That's unfair. So, we are not getting the bang for our buck. And why is that? Well, if you have a nation that spends more on professional services and consultants than it does on the Army, Navy, and Air Force combined, if you have a nation which has increased its public servant by over 40% since 2015, at now a staggering cost, if you have essentially a defense procurement system which is arguably amongst the very worst in the world for the purchase of big stuff like combat equipment, aircraft, ships, submarines. And by the way, the evidence is irrefutable. There is no evidence of the current government actually buying a large, complex, modern weapons system in the last decade.
Programs and initiatives in is this government trying to nickel and dime our CAFs that's limiting their operational capability and effectiveness? I believe you referred to that in the National Post.
Essentially, the armed forces is short anywhere between 13 to 16,000 people. And to address that shortfall is at least an additional $1 billion per year just for the personnel costs. On top of that, you have the basic and advanced training requirements. Because of the lack of progress on any of the major weapon systems needed to allow our people to survive contemporary warfare, especially as the way that the warfare examples that we have in Ukraine are showing new technologies are required, plus a whole bunch of the older ones, our armed forces are woefully inequipped, and that bow wave of equipment acquisition is what's causing the government to step back from announcing, for example, a contract for the ammunition systems, for the ships, for the planes, and it goes on, for the tanks.
You also said that about 72% of the Army's vehicles and trailers are offline. Do most of these vehicles need maintenance, or do they need to be replaced entirely?
Mr. Chair, both. Thank you for that question. So a whole bunch of this stuff is old. That which is not necessarily old doesn't have the spare parts to make sure that they can run adequately, especially when you use them for advanced training, where vehicles tend to get beaten up a bit. What is needed in this particular instance is a threefold increase. One, for additional mechanics and people who can service those vehicles. Two is for the ammunition to actually allow the systems to train, and the gas and the spare parts. And the third is the people to actually man the equipment, because with more people, you reduce the individual stresses and workloads, which has contributed to a higher attrition rate.
Are the troops we have in Latvia properly equipped and with proper vehicles, should that become a hot zone?
No, they're not properly equipped. They are doing the best with that which they have. They have the Leopard 2 tanks. They've got now a nascent air defense system for short range, but none for medium or long. They don't have an exhaustive drone suite. They don't have the articulated and dispersed command and control architectures that a modern soldier needs to survive in the battlefield, and I could go on. The armed forces are doing the best with what they have, but it's the lack of defense acquisition and essentially willingness of this government to spend money on the troops.
Of the 72 vehicles that are offline, can you break down which vehicle types are the most prevalent to be inoperable?
Currently, the vehicle types which are mostly broken are the ones you need the most when you go to war or when you want to deter Russians from advancing into Latvia. That's tanks, armored personnel carriers, light armored vehicles, artillery systems, mortar, target acquisition radars, and of course the command and control architecture is really 25 years old.
Ms. Gallant. Mr. Collins, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. General Leslie, I had the opportunity during the summer to visit the recruitment center here in Ottawa, and the staff there and the offices are doing a terrific job. And the recruiters seem to be doing an amazing job as it relates to encouraging people to apply. And it's been reported several times that we had nearly 70,000 applications in a calendar year, but only 5,000 people were making it through the process. Can I get your thoughts in terms of how do we break down, I don't want to call them bureaucratic barriers, but how do we fix that problem, knowing that it's not for a lack of people showing interest, but there seems to be some internal issues as it relates to processing those applications. The DPU speaks to that, highlights changes and recommendations that will hope to solve that in whole or in part. But can I get your thoughts on that issue in particular?
Yeah, essentially, the recruiting issue, which is it's a crisis, has been well articulated by the Chief of Defense Staff. And your numbers are quite right. It's 70,000 showed up, only 5,000 got through. Let's not forget the issue of the increase in bureaucracy. Very often when organizations are under stress, they try to centralize management. When they're under stress and try to get complicated things done to have an output, therein lies problems, because that massive degree of centralization stifles initiative, it stifles the ability to move quickly. So what we have here is a failure in process and a failure in management. And I would just like to remind all of us that according to the National Defense Act, the Minister of National Defense holds office during pleasure and has as responsibility the management and direction of the Canadian Forces. So this is a ministerial issue, and he should be personally accountable to Canada and Canadians for its resolution in the immediate sense because of the looming threat and because our friend and ally down south is getting really tired of covering for us.
So I had the opportunity to look at a couple of historical audits, and this issue goes back a number of years. Can I ask what steps were taken 10, 15, 20 years ago to resolve this issue? And it's not a new issue, so do you have any experience in that regard in terms of some of the issues that you just raised?
I do, and I'd be willing to offer them. I may sound a bit old-fashioned when I do so, but when I first joined the Canadian Forces a long time ago, it took me about 4 to 5 days to do the paperwork. There were no handheld social media devices then. At the height of the Afghan war, when we had at peak close to 5,000 troops deployed with less money and a smaller force, buying new equipment left, right, and center, we decentralized recruiting essentially down to the reserve units so that they could do it themselves because they live in the local environs much more so than the regular force. And for the regular force, we got the battalions and regiments actively involved, and we're ruthless about accepting risk. So do you have to be perfectly healthy to join the Canadian Forces? And the answer is no. But there's certain things which are showstoppers. What are they? Perhaps you can do a bit of training concurrently, accept the risk you may have duplication, make sure no one's injured prior to graduation, and carry on. Background security checks are taking way too long. How much risk is there actually in terms of a private knowing X, Y, or Z about a weapon system which is readily available in a variety of international bazaars?
I'll switch to very quickly to Russia. And, Ukrainian Canadians, those in particular in my riding, are very nervous about what comes next with the U.S.'s support or lack thereof for the war in Ukraine. And I guess I'm looking for your advice as it relates to how we deal with an issue or a person like Donald Trump, knowing that his goals and objectives related to the situation in the war in Ukraine are different than our own. I want to get your thoughts in terms of how Canada and its allies, how likely it is for Canada and its allies to succeed in assisting Ukraine in its efforts against Russia without the support in whole or part from the U.S.
So it's not my place to comment on the President-elect of the United States. That's his business, but I can give you lots of commentary about what Canada might and should consider in terms of the looming issues surrounding Russia's war in Ukraine. Let's just take a look at Canada, 41 million people, $2.4 trillion economy, and we've managed to scrape together 4 guns, 8 tanks, a couple of thousand rifles, a couple of thousand rounds of ammunition. That is nothing to be proud of. Nothing. It is abhorrent. Where is that ammunition contract for the production of 155 war shots that Ukraine has been desperately asking for, and which some ill-advised people, I was going to use a much harsher word, canceled a few short years ago? Why hasn't that been signed?
Monsieur Brunel de Sepp, I look forward to your 6 minutes on the DPU.
Oui, merci. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the witness. Mr. Lagacé, you wrote an article on 2023 defense policy and procurement costs, the case for pessimism bias. Sorry for my accent. This was a few months before the policy was announced. So you were talking about, you were optimistic that the department was more positive in its budgeting than it should have been. When you saw the new policy, do you consider that the department took into account the article you wrote a few months earlier? Now, just to provide you an example, we have just learned from one of the parliamentary officers that even the budget projections for expenditure could be 2% based on some analysis that said the Canadian economy is in a recession. So it's another way of looking at this. We take certain things for granted economically. We don't take into account different scenarios. Unfortunately, I have to say, well, we'll see what happens with the budget, especially for submarines. But I think we can stay optimistic. It's part of a culture that is always moving forward. They don't provide direct and honest answers, especially at the finance department. They always want us to spend less, and the Department of National Defense always wants to have the government's approval to move ahead with projects. So we have a situation where the Department of Defense will state that a project costs much less just to have the approval of the department. So that's what the general was saying. We have several projects that don't have the necessary money to move ahead. There is always a shortage. So sometimes, even if the project is ready to go, we decide not to move ahead because we don't have the funding necessary to meet the needs. Do you have a concrete example of a project that was where the estimates were too optimistic? We've spoken about aerial defense for land forces. This project was heavily delayed because it was poorly funded. So I don't want to give you too much information as far as my role as an advisor, as a procurement advisor, but when I saw this project within the department, it was very frustrating. It was a great need, but we didn't have the funding to go ahead. And that's just one example. I can even refer to trucks. That's just a basic. Right now, the trucking project is divided in two just to make sure we can move ahead with the budget we have. And then the other part, the tanks, have to be delayed because we were waiting for money to move ahead. This is quite common. So either the projects are not completed or they cost a lot more than was initially thought. So are we not developing some cynical attitudes from some observers and even our allies, so Canadians generally, towards the Defense Department, especially with the ships? I don't know who would think that 15 modern warships would cost $26 billion. Now we're hearing it's $100 billion rather. And so we're saying, where do these projections come from? The government is saying the budget for the 15 ships is still $60 billion, even if every other analysis says it's $100 billion. So we have to be honest with Canadians and parliamentarians in terms of the cost. We maybe think people will not realize that the cost have simply doubled or tripled. We can work that way. Thank you, General Leslie. You seem quite critical of the latest federal policies on defense. And you're certainly right about to think that way. So what observations do you have as far as the current procurement policies of the Canadian government on defense? I think our procurement system is probably the worst in the world. Quite honestly, you can simply look at the results over the past 10 years. The Canadian forces haven't obtained any modern, complex, advanced system, something that was introduced and put into service by Canadian forces. And with each year of delay, there are increased costs. Yeah, you have great interpreters that are doing so you can switch.
And as a result of 10 years of procrastination and dithering on defense acquisition, with, quite frankly, an enormous bureaucracy that has grown even bigger, that doesn't necessarily make for efficiency, the cost of buying complicated defense equipment is probably 3 times that which it was in 2015. It's kind of like the housing issue. The more you let the problem fester, the more expensive the equipment gets, which then blows to smithereens your cost estimates.
Yes, Madame Matheson, 6 minutes.
Thank you both for appearing today. So I'm always interested in talking more about that illustrious or arbitrary 2%, however you may want to deem it. There's been a lot of pressure that Canada reach it, for obvious reasons. However, and we could do so, I think, in terms of the spending that may come forward, certainly in terms of the F-35s, submarines, what have you. But as you've, and we've talked about in this committee a great deal, we have such an incredible recruitment retention crisis. We have a military housing crisis. There's a lot lacking in terms of what the rank and file need on the ground to have the kind of life to be able to do the job that we're asking of them. And there's a great reliance on that outsourcing and consulting. And I think that this is part of what you were getting at, General, in terms of that there's been cuts, and then there's been a backfill, and yet that backfill isn't actually meeting what's necessary. And I certainly think it's because of this outside consulting. That's my opinion. But do you agree that reaching the 2% through those major procurement projects isn't enough? And what do we have to do to focus to ensure that we're doing what people on the ground actually need?
Look, I deeply and sincerely appreciate the work of this committee in trying to bring to light some issues which are of ever-increasing importance to the average everyday Canadian. Unfortunately, it's a tough job because most Canadians deep down know nothing about defense, and quite frankly, I don't think the government has done a lot to lead the people of Canada into exposing them the consequences of failing to meet obligations that we promised. Let's not forget that. We promised in 2008 at the Minister of Defense level. In 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, we promised we'd meet it. Oops, 23. We're not going to meet till 2032, which is an arbitrary number chosen by the Prime Minister to get on him in a really tight jam in his visit down to Washington. And there's nothing in the fiscal framework which indicates the Government of Canada is serious about meeting that 2%. And it doesn't count unless it's in the fiscal framework. And where's that ammunition contract? Talk about an easy sell. That's representative. That's typical of where people have lost sight of the actual output required by the Canadian forces. And that's what we should be measured on. And quite frankly, that's what our allies are measuring us. So when we whine that we can't meet 2% by 2024, the rest of NATO doesn't care because we promised that we could and would. And here we are. And I think it's going to get surprisingly tough for us over the next couple of months as we get asked a lot of really hard questions in the context of North American defense, of NATO contributions, and North American free trade, all of which are linked. But a lot of Canadians don't see it that way.
It's not entirely what I asked, though, sir. Do you just do it through large procurement contracts? Or how do you balance it with what the needs on the ground are for the forces?
An excellent question. My apologies. My political skills rose to the fore. I answered the question I'd hoped you would have asked and not the one you actually did. So I've been caught flat out. Well done. The armed forces has a plan. The government has a plan. You just now have to fund it. And you have to take the timelines and compress them. Whereas in the past, you could live with a decade, now you're talking about a matter of months. Aha, impossible, you'll say. We did it during the Afghan war. We bought tanks in less than 6 months, C-17s in 4. We bought the 777s in the space of 5 or 6 months. We had troops training on those new tanks while they were rumbling forward into the battle area. And I could go on because there's a long list to demonstrate.
Pilots to fly the F-35s, or you don't have enough Navy personnel to man a sub, or?
The two are matched. You have to do one commensurate with the other. Keeping in mind it takes about a decade to produce a pilot. It takes about a decade to buy an F-35. So there should be a match when they first enter service, but there's not because the attrition rate was so high, in part because no one was willing to dedicate the energy and the time. No one outside of the uniform component willing to dedicate the energy and the time to fixing it. And now perhaps it's going to get more attention, keeping in mind the minister's responsible for this.
One of the foundations as a New Democrat that I have too, and we didn't see it at all in the defense update, was about peacekeeping. It makes zero mention of peacekeeping initiatives. And yet Canadians were foundational to the creation of that. So the government promised the international community, and maybe this falls into what you were talking about in terms of those promises and obligations that have not been fulfilled. But do you think Canada needs to do more to honor that commitment? Should it have been included in the DPU?
Absolutely. And I think I mentioned in my prepared remarks that Canada currently has 35, slightly less, military peacekeepers deployed. I'd like to point out that Ukraine, fighting a savage war in Russia, literally having to trade their soldiers' lives for ground held because they don't have the ammunition needed, which Canada could have been providing if we hadn't canceled that contract. They have more peacekeepers deployed than we do.
Colleagues, we have 25 minutes worth of questions, and we only have about 20 minutes, so we'll chop a minute. 4 minutes. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. General Leslie, how are we doing? We know at the macro level how we're doing on recruiting and retention. How are we doing with our pay and benefits for soldiers? So are we taking a hard look at that as part of our increase in spend?
Yes, we should be. They just got a recent pay raise, which was modest, but when you consider the stress that they've had to go through, especially those stalwarts which have stuck it out over the last 5 or 6 years, the middle managers, the supervisors, the sergeant majors, the warrant officers, the captains, and the list goes on. So a pay raise would certainly do wonders, especially with the cost of living increases that have happened elsewhere, but a significant one. Yes, it's long overdue.
And particularly with from the communities where we're trying to recruit from, myself in Toronto, it's a very expensive place to live. And on the reserve side, getting those soldiers out has become increasingly difficult given the lack of incentive from a salary standpoint. So I wanted to ask you about the conflict in the Middle East, the war in the Ukraine, and the general hostilities globally. How concerning is it for you, with our lack of readiness in our armed forces, to be able to participate and contribute to these global conflicts?
So Canada, as was articulated earlier, is roughly within the top 10 or 12 defense spenders, according to the way we counted. But as I think it's been quite clear through my testimony and that of others, that our output is not commensurate with the amount of money that we spend. So the first issue is to try and figure out what we have to do, what we're willing to spend to get it done, and how quickly can we get it done. And suddenly we're faced with 3 demanding scenarios, one in the Indo-Pacific with China and its expansionist tendencies. The second one is the unfolding tragedies and continuing tragedies in the Middle East, egged on by Iran and Russia. and of course the looming specter of the potential of further vast amounts of bloodshed in Ukraine, depending on what happens over the next couple of months with senior decision makers elsewhere. Is Canada prepared to fill some of the holes that could result from a more centralist view of the United States and how much they're willing to contribute to the defense of others? And we better be able to step up to the plate.
About the risk in the Arctic, you mentioned earlier that sovereignty is about being seen. Maybe there's an economic price that we're going to have to pay should we want this defended by one of our allies. To the extent that we're not in the Arctic, can we really claim that sovereignty there for outsourcing that to the United States?
Well, it's an excellent point, sir. In 2007, Russia and China have both been engaged since 2007 in a court case before the United Nations in which they do not recognize a significant portion of Canada's claims to the Arctic seabed. So if they don't recognize it, then they could challenge us just by having their exploration vessels show up in our waters. We have no permanently deployed naval forces to challenge them. So that in itself is a huge risk. By the way, they've recently formed an entente between Russia and China on Arctic exploitation, and China's articulated its vision for including an Arctic passage in its road and belt.
Do we have a strategy to counter that?
Does Canada? No.
Mr. Collins, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks to both of our witnesses.
Okay.
Anyways, yeah. Thank you for being here to answer some of our questions. I guess there's a huge amount of spending and dollars that would come if we were to meet our 2% target much sooner. And I agree that we need to work on that, and we need to get to a level of readiness considering the situation in the world and the results of the elections the other day. But of course, in order to be able to do this, the population does, to some extent, need to support this spending. And I'm wondering what messages you think our government should start sharing to the general public, because I don't think everybody follows these meetings. And this is pretty much the only public space where these conversations are had, where people can actually get this information. What messages should we be sharing to the population to get them on board with this kind of change and shift? You can both respond.
The first one I would point to is the fact that there's actually been quite a bit of movement and it's not well understood. So this is where I think I disagree a little bit with the general. New capabilities have yet to come online, but in the past few years we have bought new air-to-air refueling aircraft, we have bought maritime patrol aircraft, we are buying 88 F-35s, we have drones for the Arctic, we have Maser for the special forces, we are buying polar icebreakers, we are buying program icebreakers, we are buying a polar Epsilon satellite system. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So already the question is, it's striking to me that there remains a view, lagging indicator as it were, which we all remember from COVID, that the Canadian Armed Forces are simply unequipped and will never be equipped and everything is falling apart. That's true today because we are dealing with a decade-long or a generational gap in the capabilities we are acquired. In the next 10 to 15 years, vast numbers of new capabilities will be coming on board. There has to at least be some effort to put a positive spin on the story. Otherwise, if it is so negative, you simply put your hands up and you give up. I mean, we have to at one point also acknowledge that there is an effort to re-equip the forces, and if we want Canadians to join the armed forces, and we want them to contribute, you have to at one point tell them, we are acquiring new equipment. Otherwise, why would you join a force that is never going to be equipped? Why would you join a force that the message continuously is it's falling apart? So I agree, point to the problems. We also have to at least acknowledge that we are making progress, and this does span two governments. Various people can take credit for this. But if we solely focus on the negative and we are never trying to actually demonstrate that we are making progress, not enough, but we are making progress, that is a necessary part of the story that we have to tell if we want Canadians to be part of this institution. And I'm usually a pessimistic guy, so coming out of me, this is surprising.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. I think we have made great strides, and I think we're on the right path. But given the testimony we've heard from many witnesses, there is still a lot to be done, and you know, there's lots of improvements that could be made, and I think that our government might be willing to go there in the next budget and perhaps in subsequent budgets. And so I'm just wondering what messages we should share to the public to get them on board with this major increase in spending, in defense spending. That's, I guess, where I was going with that question.
Yes, I would say leadership is required from the federal government, and prime ministers and cabinet can't always be expected to figure out which way the parade's going and get behind it. They've actually got to get in front of this issue. And it's quite true that in years to come, the Canadian Forces will get better in terms of equipment. But in my opinion, NATO doesn't care. We said we'd get to 2% by 2024. We are a long way from that right now. And I don't think senior leadership, both existing and about to be in the United States, really cares at all what our excuses might be, because they're fairly transactional, and I'm thinking they're looking for quick results. And that has an impact on trade. And our trade negotiations are coming due now. So if you put it in that context, there's a pretty clear message.
We're going to have to leave it there. 1.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît, monsieur. Bernard Duceppe.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur.
Chair, Ms. Lagasse, you heard General Leslie's words during his intervention. The Defense Department procurement system is the worst in the world, the acquisition system. That's what he said. So do you share the General's opinion on this? And secondly, do you have a main recommendation? We're talking about completely changing the entire model. The issue is not only at the Defense Department, it's an issue with the Canadian government more broadly. The government doesn't like taking risk. They're trying to avoid risk at all costs. Why? Because when there are errors made, such as ArriveCAN, the whole system explodes, and then you have more rules, more procedures, more civil servants involved. So there's a culture within the Canadian government that avoids risk at all costs. But as the government, as the General said, if you want to move quickly, acquire equipment, develop capacities quickly, you must take a certain level of risk. In English, we say fail fast, correct? You try to make corrections right away. We haven't developed this culture within the Canadian government. In the Canadian government, it's avoid risk at all costs, even if we could set things straight later. So we have to make sure that the government be comfortable with a certain level of risk when it comes to military acquisition. Well, that's the only way we can survive in the current global atmosphere.
Madsen.
Dr. Laglass, when you came before the committee last, we were talking about procurement. We talked about sole source contracts and the problems that may exist. The study, there were many that were concerned about the transparency and accountability, so much in that sort of vein, I guess, about taking risks. You know, the United States, they have an accountability office specifically on that. Is that something that Canada needs to do? How does the government reach that accountability level in terms of those big ticket items?
The accountability problem is not one of, in Canada, of more oversight and more bodies that are checking the government. It's one of fundamental transparency. If you want greater accountability in this country, you need greater transparency. As I said last time I was here, this committee should have clearances to be able to examine all sorts of acquisition requirements, things that are moving forward in order to be able to do its work. This is fundamentally the issue. If you want to have greater accountability from government, you have to have greater transparency from government. And we don't only have the slowest accountability procurement system, we are also one of the least transparent countries out there, particularly amongst the Five Eyes. The amount of information that is withheld from you, that prevents you from doing your job, from holding the government to account, is astounding. So if we want greater accountability, step one is not more oversight. Step one is greater transparency.
Mr. Bazan, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General and Professor, for joining us here today. General Leslie, you were a Liberal member of Parliament. Did Prime Minister Trudeau or Minister Sajjan ever come to you for advice on developing things like defense policy?
To answer the question and to put it in context, prior to the 2015 election, I was the co-chair along with Mark Garneau of the Liberal Policy Platform sessions, which focused on defense, security, and borders. And in that context, the Liberal Defense Platform of 2015, I was very pleased to have quite a say and influence on, and that on also on veterans policy.
Strong, secure, engaged. How much did they consult you?
There was some, but a lot of it was based on the work that had gone into defense policy platforms. The tragedy is...
When it comes down to delivery of what was in there, did they talk to you about how to get things done, how to buy the kit that we need?
No, I tried several times, not necessarily with the Prime Minister, but his interest in defense, as we all know, is not terribly high.
Okay, so when we talk about the Prime Minister, like you mentioned the National Defence Act and how the Minister is responsible for the leadership and operation and direction of the Canadian Armed Forces and serves at will as the Prime Minister, was that lack of accountability, that lack of oversight and responsibility due to the lack of interest by Prime Minister Trudeau?
I think it's fairly clear to say that the willingness of Cabinet until quite recently to pay attention to the details of defense and to do that which the professor suggests, which is trying to reduce the levels of bureaucracy while increasing accountability. Essentially, it's gone nowhere for the last 10 years because of their level of interest in defense and security issues, which is why we're in such, not big trouble, but which is why we're in such disrepute with our friends and allies in NATO and increasing disrepute down south because we promised to do something that would involve commitment of finances, and we have not followed through on that promise, and we're being held to account now.
So with the procurements that have taken place, and Professor Lagasse has clearly laid out what the government has purchased and which us as the official opposition have been supportive of, has there been enough kinetic equipment purchased to ensure that we are able to defend Canada and participate in allied missions as required?
Absolutely, categorically not. And the focus has not been on kinetic equipment, things which harm people, keeping in mind the penultimate role of the Canadian Forces and the one which they prepare for is to engage in combat and fight and win the nation's wars alongside our friends and allies.
To buy to ensure that we're providing the equipment to protect Canada, like air defense, and what do we need to further complement our efforts in places like Latvia and elsewhere in NATO missions?
There is a list longer than my legs. My arms are a bit gibbled right now, but that I could easily rattle off. But I would just say, simply put, the short-term things which are readily achievable within a matter of months, if we have the will, long-range precision strike rocket systems for the Army, new self-propelled guns, air defense, a real system that can actually reach out and touch past the short-range system we've currently acquired. So you need short range, medium range, further range, more drone capability and command and control architectures, new naval vessels, a ship contract would be nice, ammunition for the Army would be really nice. Have I mentioned ammunition?
I think I'm running out of time here, but Professor Lagasse, not asking you to respond, but asking you to provide to the committee in writing how we bring about accountability but speed up procurement. And that comes into transparency. We need some direction on how we fix a system that's clearly broken and not working.
And if you can answer that, we'll monetize it. Yeah. 4 minutes.
And thank you both for being here. Dr. Lagasse, one of the things that we haven't talked about today is cyber threat security. And it is, we have had other witnesses before this committee talking about how this is a growing threat. Can you tell us how governments can collaborate to develop stronger cyber security measures for countries?
Thank you for the question. I think the first thing that Canada needs to realize is this is not something that will be solved within government. This has to be a partnership with the private sector. I really can't emphasize this enough. If we rely on government procedures and government IT policies in order to ensure cybersecurity in this country, we will fall short. if you look at our largest allies, they are working closely in the United States with all the big IT firms, Google, Microsoft, AWS, Oracle, in the United Kingdom with AWS, and Australia with AWS, simply because the level of expertise, know-how, and keeping pace with the threat is not something that governments, the public sector, can do adequately given the systems that we have. And in a Canadian context, this extends beyond simply working with these large firms for the national security community. It means working with them as well with the banking sector and other vulnerable sectors, because that is really, it is less an attack on national defense and the national security community that would make us vulnerable. It is an attack on civilian, private sector, banking sector that would leave us hobbled. And that is a level of cooperation which is not adequate yet.
Lieutenant General Leslie, would you like to add to that as well?
I'm going to defer to the professor. Mainly it's because it's not my area of expertise, but thank you.
Okay. So we're certainly seeing times of uncertainty at home and abroad. And how, Dr. Lagacé, how does Canada best position itself as a strong country, partner, and ally? And what investments do you think we need to make?
I would suggest that one of the chief problems that we have is we try and be all things to all people. And we try and do that on a very small budget. As I've said in many other fora, we like to think of ourselves as the Australia of North America, when in reality we are the New Zealand of North America. And this is simply to say that it's better to recognize that if we are only willing to spend 1.5% of GDP on defense, which has historically been the case, then perhaps we should focus in on specific areas and specific contributions that we can make and do it the best that we can. That may be the Arctic, which the United States has increasingly been asking us to do. It may be other specific types of roles. I simply don't know how we can keep going, spending less than what we say we're going to spend, trying to have a 2.5% of GDP defense policy on a 1.5% of GDP spend. So I would argue that we need to pick specific roles and specific contributions and do them the best that we can, as opposed to trying to do all things.
Lieutenant General.
So I understand where the professor is coming from, and it's very logical. Having said that, it's really tough to predict what the future might bring, and so you have to have a certain amount of flexibility in your suite of cards that you can play. And of course, let's not forget the value of diplomacy, a comprehensively staffed and engaged diplomatic corps, international assistance, and that other leg of the stool, if you would, is the defense deterrence capability. There may come a time when you want to focus on the UN 5 or 10 years from now, which means more often than not land-centric. Maybe you want to contribute to a force in NATO, which is usually land-centric with some air and some sea. Sovereignty depends or demands perhaps a much greater focus on surveillance, which is Air Force, satellites, which is Air Force, and then, of course, things that are on the surface of the water and underneath, which is essentially Navy. You still have to have soldiers there, but in vastly less numbers than you might need for other operations. So you have to have flexibility when you build your force to cater to differing missions, really. And it's what balance that you strike. Right now, I would submit, like the professor said, we're not doing anything terribly well.
I just wanted, it's a terrible note to end a committee on. We're not doing anything very well. Not quite sure. Sounds like Ms. Gallant will jump on that as a title for our study. I wanted, I wanted to thank both of you on behalf of the committee for joining the issue. This is a real live issue, and I think it was Ms. Lapointe or Ms. Lombropoulos said that. To everyone's great surprise here, not everybody in Canada follows the proceedings of this committee. I know they should, but it's shocking that they don't. And getting the message out there is the issue. And I particularly appreciate Professor Lagacé's sobering reminder that there have been a number of things that we've got out the door. It does remind me of an experience I had in the United States. I was leading a delegation of parliamentarians there, And my co-chair was before the Foreign Affairs Committee and said, those darn Canadians, they're falling short of their 2%, and I'm going to see them this afternoon, and I'm going to tell them so-and-so. So that afternoon, we all troop into his office, and for sure, Bill says, you know, I guess you're here because of what I said. Well, for other reasons as well. And after he beat us up, I used Professor Legacy's shopping list of things that we've actually done. And I made the point that, and we bought almost all that stuff from you. So I don't think it's entirely a dismal failure, but both of you have joined the issue brilliantly, and I think it's a real contribution to our study. So with that, we're adjourned.